At first, November 13th, 2022 looked like an ordinary night in a small college town. Students went out, friends talked, people came home, but before the night was over, 4 University of Idaho students would be dead inside a quiet house in Moscow, and by the next morning, an entire community would be asking the same question: who could have done this? The victims were Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Kaylee, Madison, and Xana lived together in an off-campus house on King Road. Ethan was Xana's boyfriend and was visiting that night. They were young college students with ordinary lives. None of them knew that their home would soon become the center of a national investigation. Earlier that night, life looked completely normal. Kaylee and Madison were out together. Xana and Ethan were also spending part of the evening together. Meanwhile, the house on King Road remained just another student home in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing about it suggested that something terrible was approaching. As the night continued, the students eventually returned to the house. Phone records and other evidence later helped investigators reconstruct parts of what happened. But the timeline contained gaps, and those gaps would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Because sometime during the early morning hours, someone entered the house. The house had multiple floors and several bedrooms. 2 other roommates were also inside that night. They would survive, but according to investigators, 4 people in the home were attacked and killed. There was no obvious sign that the neighborhood understood what was happening. Outside, the night remained almost completely normal. Investigators later determined that the 4 victims had been stabbed. The attack happened inside the home during the early morning hours. But exactly what happened from room to room was never completely reconstructed for the public. What is known is enough to understand the horror. 4 students went to sleep or settled in for the night and never got the chance to leave that house alive. Hours later, something was clearly wrong. At around midday, a 911 call was made from the King Road residence. Police arrived and discovered 4 victims inside. What had looked like a normal college house the night before was suddenly a crime scene, and investigators were facing one of the most difficult questions possible: who had entered the house? Moscow was a relatively quiet college town, and the killings sent shockwaves through the community. Students became frightened, families wanted answers, and investigators immediately began searching for evidence that could explain how 4 people had been killed inside a house without the person responsible being identified immediately. Investigators began piecing together phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence. One detail would eventually become especially important: a white sedan had been seen near the King Road area around the time of the murders. Investigators would spend weeks trying to understand who was driving it. Investigators eventually connected the vehicle to a man living in Washington. His name was Bryan Kohberger. At the time, he was a graduate student at Washington State University, only a short distance from Moscow. But identifying a possible suspect was one thing. Proving a connection to 4 murders was something else entirely. Investigators continued building their case. Evidence was examined, data records were reviewed, and forensic findings became increasingly important. The investigation was no longer simply about finding a mysterious vehicle. It was about determining whether the person connected to that vehicle could also be connected to the crime scene. On December 30th, 2022, authorities arrested Kohberger at his family's home in Pennsylvania. He was transported back to Idaho. Suddenly, the investigation that had dominated headlines for weeks had a named suspect. But the arrest did not answer every question. In fact, it created even more. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. For months, the case continued through the courts. Evidence was challenged, arguments were made, and the public waited for something it had been expecting since the beginning: a trial. But the case took an unexpected turn. In July 2025, Kohberger pleaded guilty to all 4 murders and the burglary charge. That meant there would be no full trial, where every piece of evidence would be presented to a jury. And for many people, one major question remained unanswered: why? Kohberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for burglary. Legally, the case had reached a dramatic conclusion, but for the families of the victims, a sentence could never bring back the 4 people they lost. And another question remained: what was the motive? The guilty plea established responsibility, but it did not provide the detailed explanation many people wanted. Why these 4 students? Why that house? Why that night? Those questions became part of the lasting mystery surrounding the case. And because the trial never took place, much of the public wanted to know what might have been revealed inside a courtroom. Then, in the summer of 2026, the case returned to the center of public attention. Netflix released a new 3-part documentary about the Idaho murders. Once again, millions of people were looking back at the case, the victims, the investigation, and the unanswered questions that remained after the guilty plea. And now, Another development has brought attention back to Kohberger. Reports in 2026 say he has sought to withdraw his guilty plea and pursue further legal proceedings. But that does not erase the 2025 conviction and sentence. It simply means the legal story may not be completely finished. But behind all the headlines, courtroom arguments, documentaries, and theories are for people whose lives ended that night. Kayle.Madison.Xana.Ethan. Their families were left with questions that no documentary, investigation, or sentence could ever fully answer. 4 students went to a house on King Road, expecting nothing more than another night in college. By morning, 4 families had lost someone they loved. The investigation stretched across states. A suspect was eventually arrested, a guilty plea followed, and a sentence brought the legal case to a dramatic point. But even after all of that, one question continues to haunt the story. What truly happened inside that house during those final hours? And perhaps, even more importantly, why? This is Crime Decoded.